Let's continue our look into the entire career of The Undertaker. Our last video ended at WrestleMania 21 in the Dead Man's match with Randy Orton. The year is 2005 and The Undertaker is still working as a Smackdown exclusive superstar. The majority of the year would see the Dead Man continue working with Randy Orton in an extremely entertaining rivalry, but at the same time it's a rivalry that, for whatever reason, isn't mentioned much when we discuss the overall legacy of the Phenom. 2005 wasn't just about Randy Orton though, as The Undertaker would find himself involved in one of the most controversial angles in SmackDown history. This series looks at the complete career of The Undertaker, so we'll also cover this controversial segment in this video. JBL's cabinet attacked Chris Benoit at the beginning of the June 16th, 2005 episode of SmackDown. The lights went out and The Undertaker returned to the blue brand to help the Canadian crippler. JBL retreated, but Teddy Long came out to break the news that the wrestling god was booked to go one-on-one with The Undertaker. The main event of this SmackDown would feature JBL versus The Phenom in a no disqualification match. The Undertaker had the match won, but Randy Orton showed up to deliver an RKO to his WrestleMania 21 opponent, and JBL stole the victory. Afterwards, Randy Orton told The Undertaker that he better get used to taking the RKO because the Legend Killer had been officially drafted to the SmackDown brand. This was good news for SmackDown. Randy Orton was one of the WWE's hottest young prospects, with an extremely bright future ahead of him, and it also looked like the WWE would be continuing the Orton vs Undertaker rivalry, so in my opinion it was win-win. We would have to wait a little though before we saw Undertaker vs Orton again, as the Undertaker had problems with another young superstar, another hot prospect, who seemingly had a bright future ahead of him too, SmackDown's latest draft pick, Muhammad Hassan. I've already uploaded a video looking at Hassan's entire run in depth, so I don't want to get too detailed here. This is an Undertaker video after all, but I can't talk about The Undertaker's 2005 without at least mentioning the July 7th episode of SmackDown. The Undertaker was scheduled to take on Daivari, Hassan's manager at the time. After The Undertaker put Daivari away with a tombstone piledriver, a group of masked men stormed the ring to attack the Dead Man. The Undertaker was completely destroyed. He was beat up, he was choked with piano wire, Hassan got in there and he applied the camel clutch, and after the beating had ended, Daivari was carried back up the entranceway like he was some sort of martyr who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Again, I went into more detail on this in my previous Hassan video, but all of this did not sit well with major media outlets. The timing of the angle was questioned due to the recent bombings that took place in London on the exact same day that this SmackDown taping aired on television, although the whole segment was removed from certain markets, including the United Kingdom broadcast on Sky Television. Still, the WWE were pressured into taking Hassan off TV, but the company went one step further. They didn't bother to repackage Mark Kapani, they didn't try to shoot an angle that would take the heat away. Instead, they had Hassan come out on SmackDown to bury the same media outlets that forced Vince McMahon to remove the character. This segment with Hassan ripping into the media was only broadcasted on the WWE's website, showing that Vince McMahon's grapefruits aren't as big as he'd like people to believe. Hassan was sent away after his match with The Undertaker at the Great American Bash 2005, and we'd never see him again. The Undertaker vs Muhammad Hassan at the Great American Bash is, of course, a match that the WWE would like you to forget about, but don't skip this one. Mark Kapani knew that the heel Hassan character was on his way out, as evidenced by Michael Cole announcing that this could be Hassan's final match during the entrances. But I like to think that he went out there with the intention to have fun in his potential last match. It isn't a classic by any means, it's riddled with outside interference, but it's still worth your time. In the end, The Undertaker removed some panels from the stage and Hassan took the last ride from the stage onto the floor below. We wouldn't see Hassan again. Plans to push the youngster into the world title picture were scrapped, and the WWE continued on as if nothing happened. The Hassan vs Undertaker match was for the number 1 contendership. Whoever won that match would go to SummerSlam to face the World Heavyweight Champion. An unwanted consequence of Hassan having to job to the Undertaker on the way out was the fact that the Undertaker was now the number 1 contender, and the WWE now had to figure out a way to remove the title shot away from the dead man. The Undertaker wrestled JBL once again on Smackdown with the title shot on the line, and once again Randy Orton interfered with an RKO. Kinda feels like we're back to square one here, doesn't it? The following week, Randy Orton said that the Undertaker took away his chance at immortality at WrestleMania, so Orton took away the Undertaker's title shot at SummerSlam. Orton will not rest until the Undertaker is on the long list of legends that he's beat down, and the Legend Killer challenges the Phenom to a rematch at the SummerSlam pay-per-view. The Undertaker accepts the match by changing the letters RKO to RIP. This would begin a series of matches between Orton and the Undertaker that would stretch across multiple pay-per-views, so let's take a look at this SummerSlam match first. On the SmackDown before SummerSlam, The Undertaker surprised Randy with a chokeslam at the very end of the show. Randy laughed at The Undertaker afterwards. The Legend Killer was trying to show that he was getting into the head of his opponent. The Undertaker vs Orton match was placed right in the middle of the card, just like WrestleMania 21, and I can remember being pretty excited for this one because I enjoyed the WrestleMania match so much. The only problem here though is that it is a little predictable. Orton didn't get the win at WrestleMania that would have granted him immortality, but at SummerSlam or any other show that isn't WrestleMania, a superstar's chances of defeating the dead man are much more favourable, especially when it's a WrestleMania rematch. Orton played the role of the young and cocky heel, and The Undertaker was all about teaching respect, as evidenced by the slap in the face Taker gave Orton at the beginning of the match. Orton's arrogance was his own worst enemy once again, as The Undertaker showed that experience counts inside a WWE ring, but the Legend Killer also showed that an experienced opponent can sometimes be a predictable opponent on a few occasions. This match ends with both men reversing tombstone attempts. Randy then hits an inverted backbreaker. The Legend Killer then goes for a top rope crossbody, but the dead man rolls through and we see the choke slam. Just then, a fan hits the ring and the match gets stopped for a moment. The Undertaker helps officials in getting the fan out of the ring, and then Randy Orton hits the RKO. Orton wins via pinfall, and it's revealed that the fan was actually Randy's dad, Cowboy Bob Orton. The Undertaker chases both men up the ramp as SummerSlam moves on to its next match. Naturally, The Undertaker wanted revenge, and he'd have the opportunity to not only get payback on Randy Orton, but he'd also get the chance to get Cowboy Bob Orton inside the ropes. The Ortons may have bragged that they retired The Undertaker at SummerSlam, but the dead man wasn't going anywhere. On the September 9th episode of Smackdown, The Undertaker called out Randy Orton, saying that the Legend Killer's time had come. It was time to rest in peace. Randy and Bob Orton came out, and Randy said he had a gift for the Phenom, and the Ortons presented a check to The Undertaker. The money was raised by the Ortons themselves via a WWE auction. Understandably, the dead man wasn't ready to receive his retirement fund just yet. The Undertaker sets fire to the check as the segment comes to an end. The Ortons run away, and it's clear that this rivalry is going to continue. The very next week, on the September 16th, 2005 episode of Smackdown, Randy Orton and The Undertaker had a match, and during this main event, Bob Orton brought a trailer to the ring. Inside the trailer was a casket. The WWE completely reenacted the 1996 Diesel bit when The Undertaker found himself inside the casket during the match, but still, this wasn't enough to secure the victory for Randy Orton. After the Phenom delivered a chokeslam, Orton got pinned in the middle of the ring, but Bob Orton pulled the referee out. Bob proceeded to take a spectacular bump from the dead man. Taker then reversed an RKO, and The Undertaker hits the tombstone piledriver to end the match. The Ortons tried to play mind games with the Phenom, but it didn't work on this night. But caskets would now become a big part of this storyline. Randy Orton and Bob Orton would eventually face The Undertaker in a casket match at the upcoming No Mercy pay-per-view. The next week, Bob Orton was preparing The Undertaker's funeral inside the ring. Randy Orton comes down, Bob opens the casket, and there's The Undertaker. The commentators say that this is a mannequin, Orton says it's a mannequin, and the mannequin is so lifelike that it wakes up for a brief moment to get a good look at Randy Orton talking smack. The audience goes nuts when The Undertaker grabs Orton by the throat before throwing the legend killer into the casket. The Ortons once again retreat up the entranceway, and yeah, this was a good segment here that was pulled off really well. The following week, Bob Orton challenged The Undertaker to a match. Orton promised The Undertaker that his son wouldn't get involved, but after a referee bump and a low blow, Orton showed up and a 2-on-1 assault began on the dead man. After taking a beating, The Undertaker gets pinned by the elder Orton, but Taker kicks out. He wipes out Randy Orton, and Cowboy Bob Orton ends up taking a tombstone to end the match. It looked like the Ortons were failing to get one up on The Undertaker week after week. Every attempt they made to gain some sort of advantage going into No Mercy was being thwarted by the dead man. On the Smackdown just before No Mercy, The Undertaker sent a casket down to ringside and he dared the Ortons to look inside. The Druids opened up the casket and the Ortons saw themselves lying inside. The No Mercy 2-on-1 handicap match featured more stunts and moments that we had already seen before. In particular, this casket match shared similarities to the Undertaker vs Shawn Michaels match at the 1998 Royal Rumble. This isn't a bad thing, by the way, I just thought I'd point it out. The Undertaker pretty much dominated the whole match, and the dead man was trying to weaken both Ortons enough to put them inside the casket. After delivering the last ride, The Undertaker opened up the casket to put Randy inside, but Bob Orton spread a fire extinguisher in the dead man's eyes. Taker would then eventually get nailed with a steel chair before being placed inside the casket. The Ortons had officially won the match, and afterwards The Undertaker was locked inside the casket. Randy Orton then proceeded to destroy the casket with an axe before setting it on fire. The Undertaker had once again been set alight while inside a casket, and The Undertaker would take another break from the WWE before making a spectacular return at the 2005 Survivor Series. Randy Orton represented SmackDown when the Blue brand took on Raw in a traditional Survivor Series match. Orton had a great Survivor Series record, being the sole survivor in the two previous elimination matches that he competed in. This year was no different. Randy was once again the last man standing, and he won the match for SmackDown when he hit the RKO on Shawn Michaels. As other SmackDown stars celebrated with Randy inside the ring, The Undertaker's gong was heard inside the arena. The Druids walked out and they placed a casket upright in the middle of the stage. The casket then gets set alight as Orton looks on in fear, and then The Undertaker appears. The dead man marches to the ring to get revenge on the legend killer, but Randy hides behind the other SmackDown superstars. The Undertaker cleans house and the message is sent loud and clear. This is the beginning of the end for Randy Orton. The Undertaker stares at the Ortons from the ring as the show comes to an end. The next logical step then would be putting both these guys inside Hell in a Cell, and this is exactly what the WWE did. A storyline that began all the way back at WrestleMania would come to an end inside the WWE's most unforgiving match, and I must say too, this rivalry was and still is seriously underrated. I've had a great time watching all this back for this video, and this Hell in a Cell match deserves more credit than what it gets. The match was made official on the December 2nd, 2005 episode of SmackDown after Randy had attacked The Undertaker the week prior. In what was seen as a questionable stunt by the WWE, Randy Orton put The Undertaker into the back of Eddie Guerrero's lowrider before reversing into the SmackDown stage. The car then exploded. Keep in mind that the WWE also paid tribute to Eddie Guerrero just a few weeks prior, and they even aired another tribute video before this stunt took place. The following week, The Undertaker's voice was heard around the arena as Randy Randy and Bob stood in the middle of the ring. The Phenom seriously spooked Randy. The Legend Killer tried to escape the arena, but there was nowhere he could go. He got blocked off at every exit. Randy played the part really well here. He was afraid, he was close to tears, and when The Undertaker said that Randy was going to hell in a cell, the realization of what was to come hit Orton like a ton of bricks. Randy tried to get out of it. His anxieties took over when he spoke to Teddy Long, but the Smackdown GM said it's going to happen. Randy Orton versus The Undertaker inside Hell in a Cell would take place at the Armageddon pay-per-view. Orton would once again try to get out of the match the next week, but it was no use. But on the Smackdown just before the pay-per-view, Orton accepted his fate. Bob Orton distracted the dead man with the urn, and this allowed Randy to begin attacking The Undertaker. After hitting the RKO, Orton brutalized the Phenom with a steel chair. Some serious chair shots were delivered here from the Legend Killer, resulting in The Undertaker getting busted wide open just before the Hell in a Cell match. Undertaker vs Orton at Armageddon was one of the longest Hell in a Cell matches at the time, going on for over 30 minutes. It's also not remembered as one of the best Hell in a Cell matches, but when you compare it to the more modern offerings from the WWE, it nearly turns into a masterpiece. The brutality is off the charts, there's some insane chair shots, and I know people like to kind of bury this match because it done Randy Orton absolutely no favours, but come on, Randy had gotten wins at SummerSlam and No Mercy. I think the vast majority of people should have expected The Undertaker to come out of Hell in a Cell as the winner, and also Randy Orton was made to look pretty good during this whole Undertaker rivalry. The whole draw of this match was seeing The Undertaker finally get some revenge, and as much as I like Randy Orton, I really wasn't that annoyed that he lost this match here in the Hell in a Cell. As a matter of fact, The Undertaker takes quite the beating in this match also. As mentioned, by today's standards, it's a good cell matchup that you shouldn't sleep on. Plenty of weapons get used here: chains, steel steps, chairs, tables. It's a brutal match with an admittedly predictable outcome. Bob Orton had gotten into the cell when referee Nick Patrick had to get removed from the match, and when The Undertaker hits the last ride, Bob Orton pulled second referee Charles Robinson out of the ring. The Undertaker attacks Bob Orton, and the dead man gets back into the ring to finish the match. Taker goes for a tombstone, but Randy reverses with a tombstone of his own. It was a rough looking piledriver too, but anyway, The Undertaker kicks out of two and he looks pissed off. The Undertaker keeps sitting up when Orton tries to punch him down. The Undertaker goes for the chokeslam, but Bob Orton tries to attack the Phenom with the urn. The Undertaker takes care of Bob Orton, the cowboy takes the tombstone, and then young Randy's head legit bounces off the mat when he takes the final tombstone of the match. The Undertaker finally got revenge on the young and cocky Randy Orton, and the pay-per-view ends with the dead man holding the urn on top of the Hell in a Cell. Randy Orton vs The Undertaker had ran for around 9 months, and now the feud had officially came to an end. Randy would move into a rivalry with Rey Mysterio that would lead to both Rey and Orton competing for the World Championship at WrestleMania 22. The Undertaker would have a strange 2006 though that would see him compete in a casket match at WrestleMania against Mark Henry, and then The Undertaker would begin a feud with the Great Khali, perhaps one of the biggest missteps the WWE ever made when we talk about the booking of The Undertaker. All of this though will get covered in the next Undertaker video uploaded to the channel. The Undertaker's 2005 though isn't all that celebrated, and it doesn't instantly spring to mind when we talk about the legacy of the Phenom, but do yourself a favour and take the time to watch these Orton vs Taker matches. You maybe noticed that I put off this Undertaker video for quite some time, and that was because I'd convinced myself that 2005 wasn't a great year in the Undertaker's career, but I was thoroughly entertained when I watched all this back, and I'm sure you'd be entertained too. Try to catch all the promos and segments in between the pay-per-views though, they add a whole lot to the rivalry. Thank you very much for watching and take care. A big thank you to my Patreon supporters for helping me continue to make these videos. Two guys who signed up at Patreon at the highest level possible are Felipe and Barry, and I just want to take a moment to thank both these guys for supporting the channel and supporting my work. You can also find Barry over at Instagram. I don't use Instagram myself, so send him a message and tell him Wrestling Bio sent you. A big thanks to Barry and Felipe, along with everyone else who keeps Wrestling Bios moving forward over on Patreon.